my name is Amy Stidham, and today we're going to create a Kokidama. It's a Japanese way of gardening with moss, and this is basically moss ball gardening. This is a modern technique, and most people are probably familiar with bonsai gardening, which is a little bit like this, but a lot more technique is involved in trying to create a bonsai. And it's something that takes a long time to grow. This is very quick, very easy, and I think you'll really enjoy it. Today I wanted to mention a little bit about moss before we begin. And the first thing is, typically you'll find moss in different locations outside, and you'll see that it could be on trees or on your patio or different places that seem mostly shady. Did you know that moss actually needs sun? And it does need water. So those are the two components that you'll need when you want to create your Kokidama, and also to find some soil, or excuse me, to find some moss. So moss also does not have any roots. If we look on a bag, and this is just from a bag of forest moss, or even what we would call sheet moss, and you'll see the name right at the top right here. You can buy this sheet moss in arts and crafts stores, and big box stores, and even online. You'll notice when you get your moss that it actually has a brown backing, and it looks like there's a little bit of soil attached, and then you'll have the green plant part. This particular plant does not have roots. It has rhizoids, and the rhizoids actually are the ones that cling together and they support each other. It's very symbiotic. Notice too that the leaves of the moss are the ones that actually are going to take in the water through the cells. There are no roots that bring up nutrients like a regular plant, and also that don't bring up the water. But if your moss does turn brown, it's typically because the moss is just dehydrated, and it probably needs a little bit of water to reactivate it. Now, to find moss, you could look in your backyard, on a tree, in between the cracks in the stones, and as you're walking around your neighborhood, you might find different mosses. Pay particular attention to where you find your moss, so that you'll be able to replicate the conditions when you make your Kokidama, so that you know how your moss will best react. Because you want to keep your moss as a separate plant, almost, think about it, from the actual plant that you'll be putting inside. So did you also know that moss actually propagates by its spores? And it also has, again, the rhizoids, which spread. So those are different ways that you can create more moss. So if you're interested in making more moss balls, then this is a good way to propagate your own moss, is using just different pieces and growing out your own, or even some people use the buttermilk and whipping them up technique. The other thing I wanted to mention is that some people think that you have to fertilize moss. Because moss is green, they think by adding nitrogen it might green it up. But when your moss turns brown, remember, it simply means that it's just not having enough water in it. But typically, if you just add some water or spray it, you'll rehydrate the leaves, and the cells will take up that water and they'll green up for you. The other thing that you might want to know is that there are many different varieties of moss. So if you go to the store and you're trying to figure out which kind of moss do I need to buy, here are some suggestions. So the one that I'm currently soaking, this is what's called a sheet moss. And of course, that's what it looks like, a nice sheet. It's green on the top, and if I flip it over gently, you'll see the brown on the bottom. So they've obviously scraped with a nice trowel this from the rock or the soil where it actually existed, and they dehydrated it and preserved it so that they could place it in the bag. So all I did to hydrate my moss is I just took some water and I poured it right over the moss. Let it sit for about 10 minutes, and that'll make it a lot more flexible. You might see some other types of moss in the store and wonder if this is a good moss to make a Kokidama. This right here is called Reindeer Moss. Now, even though it says moss on the label, this is not moss. This is actually lichen. And so just because sometimes I'm a rule breaker, I decided, well, why don't I just try it? So I wanted to show you that you actually could make a Kokidama with this, but the fact is that this is a very difficult substance to use because it's in all these little pieces. So I had to really hold the ball together, and it did require a whole lot more tying. So again, that's not a moss, but if you happen to see it, don't be fooled. That's not really the one you want to pick. You can pick one that's called forest moss, and forest moss is like sheet moss except for one thing. They probably just bunch it up in the bag. So as you can see, it comes out in pieces, and if I unravel it, there's the bottom. But you can see all the pieces start to fall off. It makes it a little bit more difficult to use. So my first choice would always be a sheet moss. And again, you can find this at the store, or you can find it online. But it typically says sheet moss at the top, and it's preserved forest moss. And you can tell the difference too between a fake moss and something else. I also just tried, just for the fun of it, using Spanish moss. Now, typically when you see this hanging in a tree, it's what color? Gray. So what they did is they dyed this to make it look like it. I just wanted to make one just to see what it would look like, but my hands turned green. So you can make it with Spanish moss. It's kind of fun, but it's not typically the one that would be a Kokidama. But I just wanted to show that to you, just in case you wanted to be creative and try new things. So the other thing that's important is to have a few tools. So today for our class, you're going to need a pair of scissors, and you'll need a spray bottle. You'll need some assorted soils, and this is an Akadama soil. We'll go over that in a minute. You'll need some water, some twine, or you could actually use fishing line if you didn't want to see the twine. But if you're a beginner, I would suggest that you use the twine that has more of a texture to it. The reason for that is it's really hard to hold the ball and try to wind it at the same time. So the thicker and more textural your string is for the first couple times you do it, the easier it will be for when you actually create one. Then you need like a little tub like this to put your moss in, so I'm hydrating that. And this is a little planting tray, and I have it turned around. Normally I'd be on the other side, but I wanted you to be able to see the area right here where I'm gonna mix the soil. You can have a little bowl, and this helps to put the Kokidama in it when we're trying to go from one stage to the next. And I have a little container that I put some of the Akadama soil in it, just to help me get it started. And of course, to keep things tidy, I have a tablecloth. So, we already talked a little bit about the moss and the fact that I'm hydrating it right now. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to choose a plant. What kind of plants would you use in a Kokidama? Now think about it. If you've ever used a grow bag before, you'll notice that the outside actually has a lot of air circulation. And so it keeps the roots kind of interior to the grow bag. Think about it just like a Kokidama. Your moss ball is going to be your container. And so anything that enjoys being in this kind of condition, like say a fern, or even a house plant, this is a Fittonia, or an ivy, begonia, there's some mint, and some rosemary. The typical plants that you could use also include succulents. This is a little succulent. It kind of likes a dry condition. And here is a spider plant. So a lot of these plants also can be watered very easily, and I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. So don't be worried that it has to be something that's always dry, because we will be watering our plants as we go. So let's go ahead and let's get our soil mix together. Now typically I would put my gloves on for this, because we're going to make a mess. So get a good pair of gloves that have some water seal around them, because we're going to be squeezing the ball, and there's going to be a lot of water coming from the soil and the moss itself. So I'm going to make a little pile of soil, and there's several different kinds of soil. There's a cactus mix, I think works really well. That comes in different varieties too. There's a spoma, there's black and gold, or black gold, and there's Miracle Grow. The nice thing about Miracle Grow, it has a teeny bit of fertilizer in it, because only the plant needs the fertilizer. The moss actually does not need more fertilizer. So it's okay to have it in the soil. That would be all right. So we're also going to include what's called Akadama. This is a Japanese baked clay, and you can actually get this online or in a craft store, but you'll notice that it's just dried up crushed clay. This is different than the regular clay that you'd find at your house, because when you take normal clay from your yard, if you put water on it, it would start to turn slippery, and it would dissolve basically into a sticky mess. When I actually take Akadama, which is a bonsai soil primarily, and I wet it, it just turns a different color. But it stays in its compact shape. It holds water, but it doesn't break down into tinier particles. It stays more together. So I'm going to use about 1/3 of my Akadama. I'm going to put it right in the center. It's okay if there's some water because we're going to be adding some more. I'm going to take some of my potting mix. Let's just use the rest of this one. And this one has peat moss, pine bark fines, sand, and of course I mentioned it already has a little bit of fertilizer, and there could be some, a little bit of peat in there too. The idea behind this is you want to make a ball. So if you're trying to get a soil that has, say, a lot of vermiculite, like say this one, this is going to be very difficult to put together. So if you notice that in particular this black gold right here has a lot of this white puffy stuff in it, that's great for aeration. It's great for plants, but in a container when you're trying to, in the Kokidama, when you're trying to put the ball together, it'll actually start to fall apart. So I would go with something that's more compact and has less of the perlite in it. I think I said vermiculite, but I meant perlite. Okay, so just like making pasta and kneading dough, this is a very relaxing type of activity. So we're just going to add a little bit of water into the center, and I'm going to knead it. Knead it like a cat. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to mix the soil together first of all, and then I'm trying to hydrate the soil, because remember there's a lot of peat in here, and there's also the Akadama, as well as just the soil mix from the cactus mix. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that when I make the ball that it sticks together. So add a little bit more water. Don't be afraid to add some. And just keep mixing it up. And take your time. This is supposed to help you relax. And it's nice to make that big snowball. And don't worry about how perfect it is. It doesn't have to be, and you can always go back and make changes later. And we're going to kind of take it step by step. So we make a nice ball like that. And you know that it's set because all of the pieces don't start falling off. They actually stick together. So in order to keep this in its shape, I'm just going to put it in my bowl and just set it aside for 1 second. And then I'm going to take my gloves off, because I notice that when I use the moss, if I have my gloves on, what happens is I get my moss all dirty. It doesn't look as good. So I'm going to reach over and I'm going to grab my hydrated moss. And of course there's the brown side, and then there's the green side. I'm going to hold it in my hand, because what I want to do is then pick up my ball and put it in the center. And very gently, I'm going to wrap it up, and it looks like it fits. So that's good. Now, I'm going to lay it back down. And now I'm going to find my plant. So we picked a couple plants. Let's today pick the Fittonia. Now with the Fittonia, I'm going to take it and put my hands gently between the stems, because I don't want to break the stems. Squish the bottom a little bit, and I'm going to flip it over. Gently release it from the container. Just set your container aside. You won't need that anymore. And then you're just going to very gently break the soil apart. And I'm teasing out most of the soil. I don't need this soil. I just need what's in the Kokidama ball that I just created. So about like that is pretty good. I got most of the soil off. I was very gentle with the roots, because I really don't want to tear the plant apart and lose a lot of the root system. I want to try to keep that intact, because it is a little bit stressful for a plant to be unrooted like that. Then I'm going to take my Kokidama ball, and you can either break it in half or you can put a hole in it. I tend to like just breaking it in half. It's easier for me. And then take your plants and lay them inside. Okay, here comes the fun part. You're going to get a little dirty, but that's okay, because I have a towel with me. So I'm going to grab my soil ball, and I'm going to put it back on my plant like this. And just keep squeezing it until you can make sure that it's all solid again. And if in fact you need some more soil, go ahead and grab more soil or grab some more water. And sure enough, you'll encase your plants just like that. Now we'll go back and get our soil. So I'm going to rinse my hand off a little bit. I'm going to take my moss and I'm going to gently wrap it around my plant. Now it's obviously a square and I'm trying to cover a ball. So you can gently just kind of push the moss around your ball using both hands very patiently. It's therapeutic to work with plants. They respond to touch. And if you have a little extra and you don't need it, you can just take off little pieces. Just be careful not to take off too much, because it's a little bit harder to add a little piece than it is to just take off a little piece. So when you start to get the ball created, go ahead and start squeezing it a little bit, making sure that the moss is very well adhered to the ball, just like that. Okay? So next thing we're going to do is we're going to grab our string, and you're going to leave a long end, because this is what we're going to tie it with, but I may want to use it to hang. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to place it at the top of the plant. And then I'm going to start to wrap it around. And you kind of wind it just like you would a yarn ball, around and around. And you want to crisscross it too. You want to cross to different sides of the plant and trying to keep the center. So if you have to move your hands back and forth, and if you have to undo it and start again, that's okay, because you want to make sure you cover all the edges. You want your Kokidama to fall apart. When you feel like you have enough, and that's kind of a personal preference, I've seen some that have had several lines of string around them. It's just based on what you think might be appropriate for the look that you want, but also to hold the moss together. Take the long end and go right underneath one of the strands, because you want to be able to connect it to the one that you're wrapping. And also, you don't really want to strangle your plant by wrapping it around the center. Make sure you wrap it side to side, and that way you won't run into any trouble. So then we're just going to tie it off. And if you feel like it's not completely secure, go to the other side, go underneath the strand, and that'll keep it from running up into the plant, and make one more tie. Feel free to leave a little bow if you want, or you can just leave it as a knot. I think I'll leave it as a knot today. And then I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut the end, or you can leave it with two. And this is your moss ball garden. So now how do I take care of this? Now remember, I said wherever you got your moss from, look at the conditions, because most likely it had a little sun and it had plenty of water. The other thing is you don't need to fertilize it, because remember we talked about there's no roots in moss, and so it gets its water from its leaves. But the plant inside might need fertilizer. So if in fact I need to water, the best thing to do is to take your container and to fill it with water. And then you can sink your Kokidama right into the bubbles and watch the bubbles come up. And as it's soaking up, it's going to get heavy. And so when it's after about 10 minutes, take it out and you're just going to squeeze it just a little bit. Just like that, to kind of reform it. And then you can put it in a colander if you want to drain it before you hang it in your house. Or if it's outside, just go ahead and hang it on your tree, just like that. And then you can have several, and you can have them at different heights. And you can see the movement in the garden. They make a nice piece of artwork, as well as a very beautiful addition to your garden. And the other thing is, if you are wondering whether or not it's going to be ready to water, there's two signs. The first is if the moss starts to turn brown. Typically, that would be something that you can, it was still kind of a heavy ball. You can just spritz it with a little bit of water just to rehydrate the moss. If your moss ball itself is actually pretty light, that's the time to water it. So go ahead and sink it into the water. Let's see. The only other thing is, if you want to do any pruning on it, like say you have a little leaf that may have gone astray, or you didn't like maybe some of the moss sticking out, you can simply just take your scissors and you can trim it, and you can make it all nice and tidy like that. Or you can trim your plant and you can take off long pieces if you want to make it a more artistic look for yourself. I also use rainwater, and I use it at like a lukewarm temperature, so I'll bring it inside. So that's a great mineral water to use if you're wondering about what kind of water to use. If you're going to put it inside, a couple things to be aware of. You want to keep this away from direct sun and also from any drafts. So if you have a heater or an air conditioning unit, try not to put your Kokidama within that airflow. And then again, you can hang them, and you can also display them on little trays, and you can group them. And in the picture that you saw, I had a Kokidama and a little vase, as well as maybe a little cup that had a flower floating in it. So if you have any other questions or if you need some more information, please contact the North Carolina Cooperative Extension. And I hope you had a fun day today, and I hope you enjoyed making your Kokidama. Thank you.